Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Inept General, and welcome to our video on Reikland lore. Now, this is the final part of my entire series covering every province of the Empire in Total War Warhammer, or Warhammer Fantasy, if you will. Now, if you want to check out any of my previous episodes, whether covering Middenland, or Ostland, or Stirland, whatever you like, do check the top right-hand corner now, or you'll find a link in the description below if you want to check that out later on to find out about the other provinces within the Empire. But without further delay, let's kick things off by looking at the province of Reikland. Now, Reikland is located in the southwestern part of the Empire, and whose beginnings, like many of the other provinces of the Empire, begin with its founding. So, let's take us back to the year -30 of the Imperial calendar, so around 2,500 years before the start of the Total War Warhammer timeline. At this time, there are the beginnings of what are known as kind of kingdoms, individual kingdoms or tribes that are roaming the territory that would one day become known as the Empire. Now, the area of Reikland is occupied by people known as the Uberigen, or the Uberigen, one of the two pronunciations there. I'm not exactly sure which one's correct, but I'm going to stick with Uberigen for the sake of this video. So they own the province that would one day become Reikland, and around the year -30 of the Imperial calendar, their chief is about to give birth to a son. Now, he and his wife go off to see a wizard, and the wizard isn't at his usual place, kind of outside of their settlement a little bit, and instead they're ambushed by a series of orcs. Now, the orcs start to just attack the group. Now, it's the chief, his bodyguard, and his wife, who's heavily pregnant at the time, and during the course of this battle, the wife starts to go into labor. But the fighting men, including her husband, all have their hands tied, trying to see off this orc ambush, and they take heavy casualties, but they end up managing to fight their way out of it. However, by the time the chief gets back to his wife, finds his newborn son, unfortunately in a puddle of blood, and his wife dead next to him. Now, she had bled out from the process of childbirth, unfortunately, but the child that was born that day was in fact Sigmar. Now, Sigmar would go on to become the first emperor of the Empire, and he got the idea in his head that humanity had to bind together to fight off the threats of the Warhammer world. Now, he got all the different major tribes from all the different regions of what would become the Empire, got them all to band together through various means, and then ended up marching a huge army of men against a devastatingly large army of orcs at the infamous Battle of Blackfire Pass. Now, he became victorious that day. He ended up defending the Empire long after that, fighting off the Norseguns, fighting off Nagash, fighting off a whole different type of threat, whether it be the undead, or just the forces of chaos, or indeed returning greenskins. But eventually, they win out, they beat most of the main threats to what would become the Empire, and the Empire is founded in year 1 of the Imperial calendar with Sigmar as its first emperor. Now, the system of elect accounts is set up where Sigmar still respects that each tribe had its own individualistic culture and nature, and allows the chiefs of those tribes to become elect accounts who are able then to select the next emperor after he passes on. It's not a hereditary title. And after some time, Sigmar in fact vanishes. He's only emperor for about 50 years and then vanishes to the east, never to be seen again. Over the course of that 50 years, however, he did establish a couple of things. He established Reikland as the capital province, and he established the first city, which I think at the time was Reikdorf, as the capital city of the Empire. And I think Reikdorf roughly translated as city on the river at the time, and this would go on to be the capital for a bit. However, after some time, because of the elect account system where it's not a hereditary title, the elect account is elected by all the other kind of kings or elect accounts of their individual provinces, and they decided to pick an emperor who was not from Reikland, and indeed he moved the capital away, not wanting the capital to be in Reikland anymore, and moved it to Wiesenland, I think. Now, that happened, and then that kind of moves around. The capital tends to be wherever the emperor decides it is. But it left a bit of a power vacuum in Reikland itself. Now, not long after, we're sort of talking about anywhere from 100 to 500 years after the founding of the Empire, the Church of Sigmar begins to become a significant force within the Empire itself. With the first Grand Theogonist being sort of put into power in the year 73, so only some 20 odd years after Sigmar decided to disappear. And then from there it only grew. They started to build a small temple in the Reikland. That then grew many years later into the great cathedral to Sigmar, and the religion started to spread, worshipping their ex-emperor as a god. And this took up much of the sort of main power deciding factors in Reikland for a very long amount of time. There was, however, always still an elect account of Reikland, so they did always have that individual leadership, but the Church of Sigmar started to become a huge force in the province. By the year 500, an emperor known as Sigismund the Conqueror is sitting on the throne of the empire. Now, he is responsible for a huge amount of growth in the empire, and the empire was much larger than it is today, as we see on this map. In fact, it spread south into the area we now know as the Border Princes, and started to encapsulate large parts of what we now know as Bretonnia. But that eventually got whittled back after the passing of Sigismund. But Sigismund was a great emperor, and under him, the whole empire grew, but so did Reikland as well. And that's when we start to see, I think it may have been before this actually, but around that time, we see the name change from Reikland, which is city on the river, to Altdorf, which I believe meant old city in the language at the time. And it grew 4 times the size it originally was, and started to build sort of huge defensive walls, and become a real military powerhouse as well as a cultural one. Blessed with fertile lands, farming became a huge aspect of Reikland, and it became quickly known as the breadbasket of the entire empire, with the amount of crops they could bring in, really helped support their neighboring provinces. However, it was struck, like the rest of the empire, in the year 1111. Now, that's said to have destroyed a huge percentage of the population of the empire, and Reikland was not spared. They lost huge amounts of people, and that ended up leading into the eventual invasion of a huge Skaven army. Now, this was fought back, and so Reikland and the rest of the empire was spared, but the whole population takes a dive around that time. Also, interestingly, around the year 1500 of the imperial calendar, 1547, the whole civilization of the empire starts to disintegrate. Without a strong leader, a series of incompetent emperors, religious strife between the old gods and the new worship of Sigmar, the empire descends into civil war. Now, interestingly enough, Reikland isn't hugely involved in this civil war aspect. There's a number of provinces declaring for different emperors, the whole thing slightly chaotic, but Reikland kind of stays out of it to a certain degree, at least according to some canon. Now, other canon has the emperor at the time of the civil war and the whole period around that, which lasted centuries, sometimes being in Reikland. Now, whether that's a chosen emperor or emperor of one side or the other is kind of hard to nail down, because sometimes the lore is contradicting. But we'll just say it's a time of tumult, and there's a whole lot of stuff going on. It's just chaotic, multiple emperors around, the whole place is just fighting, breaks out from time to time, but it's not the stable empire that Sigmar left behind. And that brings us on to the first real threat to face the empire since really the Age of Sigmar. There's been smaller threats, but this is the first big one, and that is the Greenskin War of Gorbad Ironclaw. Now, Gorbad came up from the Badlands leading a huge host of greenskins, and they plowed through the Southern Empire. They went into Averland, they moved south into Wiesenland, and then a province which they absolutely decimated so badly it no longer exists, which is the province of Solland. If you'd like to know a bit more about Solland, do check out my video on Wiesenland, which covers kind of what happened there. But they decimated it so badly that they could never recover, and its territories got split up between Averland and Wiesenland. But then he moved up, and he eventually got to the capital at the time, apparently, which was Altdorf. Now, he got to the walls, and he'd been wounded in a previous battle. The Empire had been facing kind of a running battle with him ever since he came over Blackfire Pass, and he was pissed, and as a result it actually played into the hands, because over the last 1,000 years the Empire had been building up the walls of Altdorf incessantly, working on its defenses, working on its ability to hold out during a siege, and all those centuries of building paid dividends here. Wave after wave of greenskin attacker was crushed against the walls of Altdorf, and they couldn't make a breakthrough. Gorbad, still being enraged and impatient, decided to try it from a different approach. And now I think it's the southern approach to Altdorf is completely covered in marshland. Now many of the greenskins kind of got caught in the marshes, drowned, trampled on each other, just ended up being a horrible idea for Gorbad Ironclaw all round. And only by that stage, after wasting so many troops, did he come to his senses and start to set up siege equipment, set up some rock lobbers, and then he unleashed his most powerful weapon. He unleashed dozens of wyverns upon the city of Altdorf, who came crashing in, killing civilians, killing everything they could. In fact, a wyvern crashed into the imperial palace and ended up killing the emperor at the time, who is described as Sigismund. Now, I think he's Sigismund IV, so not Sigismund the Conqueror we spoke about. He existed some millennia beforehand. Now, Sigismund IV ends up a chew toy for this wyvern, gets absolutely destroyed, but the wyverns are eventually killed by the troops within the city. And that's kind of like all Gorbad had. That was his best weapon, didn't seem to work, he didn't get in, and so the people of his war start to turn against him. I say people, I mean greenskins, start to turn against him. There's internal squabbling, the war starts to break up, and that's when the troops of Reikland and the Empire ride out and start hounding down the smaller groups of greenskins within their territory, taking them out as they retreated back across their path of devastation into the Badlands again. Now, eventually, a dwarven army catches up with Gorbad, and that's the last anyone sees of him. Whether Gorbad died or not is a mystery. Now, if you'd like a fully detailed version of Gorbad, I believe he's mentioned in my Missing Legendary Lords for the Greenskin video, popping up in the top right-hand corner now, or you'll find a link in the description below. But he was fought back and disappeared thanks to the impenetrable walls of Altdorf. The province then went on peacefully, really kind of as far as peace goes in the Warhammer world, for the next 300 years or so. However, by the year 2010, there was a dark stirring in the east. Vlad von Carstein had taken up the rulership of Sylvania, and the vampire wars began. Vlad, looking to have an empire of the dead, began his slow but inevitable march towards Altdorf, doing it very tactically, not trying to go straight for the heart, but fighting back from the outer provinces, increasing his power, moving slowly but inevitably towards the imperial capital. And he reached the walls of Altdorf by the year 2051, so he wasn't in any rush, and it was the winter of that year. Armies found it hard to move, but not an army of the dead. So Vlad arrives at the gates, and despite their attempts to build extra defenses, they even tried to divert the River Reik around Altdorf itself to try and dissuade his armies. Nothing worked. Vlad still made it to the gates. Vlad stood in front of the gates of Altdorf and decreed to those inside, "Open the gates and serve me in life, or fight and serve me in death. I leave you time to decide," and then kind of retired off for the evening before deciding whether to attack. They had like the night to think on it. However, the Grand Theogenist had got word that the secret to Vlad's power, because apparently he'd been beaten on a few battlefields, but he always popped back up. No one knew how to deal with him over this inevitable crawl across the empire to the capital. However, he got word that, maybe try and steal Vlad's ring. And so the Grand Theogenist, who, spoilers here if you're looking to get into the story, got word from Manfred von Carstein that the secret to Vlad's power was his ring. So the Grand Theogenist employs a thief to go and steal the ring, and then, which he does successfully. I believe the thief's name was Felix Mann. So Felix Mann manages to steal the ring, but then Vlad wakes up and he is enraged. He immediately orders the attack on the city, and they get in the walls, they clamber over the walls. It's just a wave of corpses. Now, as the battle unfolds, Vlad finds himself fighting the Grand Theogenist on the battlements of Altdorf. Their battle is ongoing. The Grand Theogenist, with a number of blessed pieces of equipment that help fight vampires, one has to imagine, imagine probably slowing down or somehow managing to keep the power, speed, and strength of one of the most powerful vampires to ever walk the Warhammer world in check for over an hour as they battled, how the Grand Theogenist could feel himself tiring, and in a final desperate move managed to angle himself and Vlad so they both tumbled over the side of the battlements and they fell to be impaled upon one of the wooden spikes set up on the defenses below. Vlad fell first, with the Grand Theogenist falling on top of him, seemingly ending the life of Vlad von Carstein, driving that wooden stake straight through his chest. Having seen Vlad die, a lot of the magic that bound vast amounts of his army undid. The rest of the vampires in his service kind of fled because they felt they would lose the battle. His wife, Isabella, from whom he'd inherited the actual title of the Count of Sylvania, eventually was so distraught that her love had died, ended up killing herself there and then on the battlefield, seeing her lover's body on that wooden spike. And that was the end of Vlad and Isabella von Carstein, at least for then. Eventually, Konrad von Carstein ended up taking over the leadership of the von Carstein line and the vampire armies through really just brutality and lack of subtlety over anything else. He led a campaign against the Empire, but I don't think he ever got as far as Altdorf, as far as I remember. So Konrad eventually does some humorous stuff by bringing back a guy's father and having him be a zombie, and Konrad's great. For the Konrad story, do check the top right hand corner now. There'll be some Konrad von Carstein lore there. But unfortunately, he didn't really have much of an impact on Reikland. So the next person to actually get into Reikland is still an ongoing continuation of this vampire war. Because after Konrad fell, Manfred returned and took over. And this was kind of his long-term planning ever since he told the Grand Theogenist about Vlad's ring, to try and overthrow Vlad as the leader of the von Carsteins and take over. He was happy to let Konrad have his time, but Manfred was stepping into the post, and indeed, Manfred managed to lead a vampire undead army to the gates of Altdorf yet again. However, this time, the Empire of Man was a little bit more prepared. The Grand Theogenist of the time, who'd replaced the previous one, known as Kurt III, ended up digging out a secret book the Empire had acquired, known as the Liber Mortis. Now, this had dark magics of the undead, and it was only the purest of heart in the Empire ever even allowed to look at this book, let alone use it. But in this time of dire need, with Manfred marching an army towards them, the Grand Theogenist read from the book and read the spell of unbinding, causing vast amounts of Manfred's army just to stumble down like marionettes with their strings cut. So Manfred is like, okay, I need a different approach if they have this book and they're willing to use this magic against me. And so he went to Marienburg. Now, he went to Marienburg, took over the city fairly easily, and his idea was to sail ships up the River Reich and attack Altdorf from the port in a kind of surprise attack that they wouldn't see coming. However, the Empire gets wind of where Manfred is, sends an army out from Altdorf to attack him at Marienburg. He's chased off, and then essentially is another series of ongoing battles, fighting Manfred all the way back to Sylvania until he is finally done in at the Battle of Helfen. And that's the end of Manfred von Carstein for a good amount of time. So again, the armies of Reikland proving the last line of defense in the survival of the Empire. After the Vampire Wars, the Empire was crippled. They lost so many soldiers, so many fighters, so many people. It was really kind of a hard time. And kind of building off the back of that, they had a relative era of peace. The next major threat emerging from within Reikland itself, in the hills of the Grey Mountains to the south of Reikland, has always been a very disturbing place known as Castle Drachenfell. Now, Castle Drachenfell has been there as long as anyone can remember, and we're going to get into a little bit about Castle Drachenfell when we have a closer look at the province. But in the year 2203 of the Imperial calendar, a host of demons poured forth from the gates of Castle Drachenfell into Reikland, absolutely annihilating the cities of Überschreik and Burgenhafen. However, the demons were face down, they were fought back, eventually receding back into the horrible realm from which they came. Little were the armies to know at the time that this was maybe just a precursor of horrible things from the realm of chaos to come. Now, we have a bit of an era of peace then for the next century, with, some domestic disputes getting in the way. In the year 2211, there's a kind of mining dispute between the dwarves of the Grey Mountains and the people of the Empire, where the dwarves dammed up a river, really kind of cutting off the water for a huge agricultural basin within Reikland, known as the Runtwater Incident. Now, this caused a whole bunch of peasants to march on the capital, being like, hey, where's our water? And kind of having to, I think, give in to the dwarven demands. And it has been an ongoing tactic ever since the dwarves realized they could do this if there's ever a mining dispute that comes up with getting the ore out of the Grey Mountains. So the dwarves can be a bit of a domestic annoyance, but never, a militaristic threat. Now, over this same period of time, for the next century, following this demonic invasion, there's a series of strange cults that begin to pop up in every major city within the Empire, not just in Reikland. Now, these eventually get in the way of good governance, and around the year 2302 of the Imperial calendar, a call comes in from the Empire's allies of Kislev, saying, "Help, help! Chaos! Help!" A huge chaos army was coming down upon the kingdom of Kislev, and they needed help from the Empire. The Empire was so tied up and under the influence of these minor cults that they never got round sending aid. They felt they didn't have to. Arguments were being made on both sides. There was a lot of capitulation going on. Kislev isn't our problem. And it took what eventually ended up being a huge cult of chaos eruption, coming out into the open, declaring who they were in the city of Nullen in Visenland, to actually give rise to a champion there who would go on to be known as Magnus the Pious. Magnus the Pious put down the chaos cults in his own city, and then went around the Empire recruiting troops, purging each city as he went of the horrific chaos cults within, and then collecting troops to go and fight the bigger threat up north. Reikland was no exception to this. He visited the city, got troops, destroyed the heretics, and then began to move north to help their allies in Kislev. Now, they sent word out from the Empire to other allies, including the elves, and it was the elven magician Teclis who answered their call, coming to back up the army of Magnus the Pious as he charged north to fight the Chaos Invasion with Reikland troops along his side. Now, the Chaos Invasion was eventually utterly destroyed by Magnus the Pious. He ended up being elected as Emperor, and that kind of brought the Empire together after all this time. During all this period, there's no real set emperor. Magnus the Pious is the one who unites everyone again under the single rule of one emperor at a time, and that's it, as opposed to all these different fighting factions declaring their own emperors for different periods of time. Magnus the Pious brings it all back together. However, he's not set himself up in Reikland. He's over in Nullen in Visenland, where he runs his government from. Now, Teclis, the High Elf Mage, who, if you want to know a bit more about him, check out his lore video, popping up in the top right-hand corner. But Teclis, the High Elf Mage, with some of his friends and allies who'd come to the aid of the Empire of Man, decided to stick around for a bit, and he saw huge potential in man, and decided to try and teach mankind how to properly master the winds of magic. And in so doing, he actually set up base, I believe in Altdorf, where he ended up establishing the colleges of magic to teach mankind how to properly manipulate the winds of magic. So Teclis is kind of the founder of all magic within the Empire. He eventually leaves the Empire and goes back home to Ulfwan. I think it was for the funeral of his father. That's what ended up calling him back. But, as mankind is wont to do with new power, we ended up finding a way to bugger it up. And by the year 2415, a horrible catastrophic event happens in the city of Altdorf, known as the Night of 1,000 Arcane Jewels, where the different colleges of magic, all under rising tensions between each other, ended up having a night of battle and destruction. They unleashed their newfound powers of the winds of magic upon each other, dueling mages all over the city, lightning, fire, people being turned into molten metal. It was just a horror show. And ever since then, sort of, they're like, we can never allow this to happen again. Things got out of hand with the tension between the colleges. And ever since then, it's been peaceful. But there was a horrible night within the city of Altdorf in Reikland, with just mages raining down destruction on everything around them. So now we're getting very close to kind of current Total War Warhammer timeline. So we're looking at the year 2420 of the Imperial calendar, and we're now under the rule of Dieter IV. Now, Dieter IV is renowned as perhaps the least capable and most unworthy emperor to ever sit on the throne. He was disliked widely at the time, and he also was known for several cowardly acts. First, and probably worst of which, was the fact that in around this year, the dwarves of Karazakarak came to him and said, hey look, Empire, there's a huge army of greenskins coming up. We can, fight them together, but just be warned, you need to face them at Blackfire Pass if they're coming up for you. We might just hide in our carracks. And what he did, Dieter, instead of doing anything wise, he just moved his imperial court from Nullen at the time further north to Altdorf, leaving the southern parts of the empire at the mercy of the war of Grom the Paunch. Now, again, guys, we've covered Grom the Paunch on the channel before. If you'd like to know about him, do check the top right-hand corner now, or you'll find the link in the description below. But Grom the Paunch is a goblin who ate a bit of troll and ended up becoming huge, also gaining some regenerative ability. But this allowed him to climb the social ladder of greenskinness and ended up leading a huge war against the Empire. So they came up through the southern parts of the Empire, into Averland, into Visenland, and eventually ended up taking the city of Nullen, where the Emperor had had his court previously. But the Emperor refused to ride out to face him, and indeed at this point Grom the Paunch takes the city of Nullen and begins to run effectively a greenskin empire within the empire itself. He sends out raiding parties to ransack all the surrounding provinces, and no army is of the size to stand up against him. They just can't do it, and Dieter refuses to marshal up men and go and face this greenskin abomination. Grom the Paunch is set up at Nullen for a good long time, and in defense of his own province of Reikland, not the Emperor, but the Count of Reikland at the time, a chap by the name of Wilhelm, was ending up having to defend his own province. And so what he'd do is he'd gather the whole forces he had at his disposal as the Count of Reikland and march out against smaller bands that he knew were going to try and ransack his land, steal the crop, steal the harvest, stuff like that. And they were successfully managing to fend them off. And in so doing, effectively what Wilhelm does is save Reikland, and in saving Reikland, which at this point is the only province that still has food to share around with the other provinces, and all the other resources you need, he manages to effectively save the Empire. Now, Grom the Paunch really doesn't get defeated by Wilhelm. What happens is Grom the Paunch, from his magician counselor, gets word that he has to go to Ulfwan, and he has a merry adventure over there in the land of the elves, causing them all kinds of trouble. Again, check out his story if you want to know exactly what happens there. But Grom the Paunch just leaves the shores of the old world and just goes. So then the Empire is devastated, and all that's left kind of untouched is the province of Reikland. Now, dealing with this devastation, dealing with his own financial mismanagement of the Empire, and his own level of personal corruption, what happens is a very powerful merchant guild begins to suggest and whisper to the Emperor that he should sell them almost one of the crown jewels of the Empire at the time, which was the city of Marienburg. Now, Marienburg was part of a province previously known as Vesterland. So they were a province within the Empire as well, but these guys are like, hey, Emperor, we'll just give you this huge amount of money and you let us run ourselves. We're no longer part of the Empire, we run our own thing. And you know what, Dieter was such a sniveling, coward, rich guy that he took the personal bribe they offered him as the Emperor himself and sold off Marienburg. This enraged every other major elector count within the Empire. It enraged the Empire itself. No one could understand why he was doing this. And so very promptly after doing that, not just being a coward during the whole Grom the Paunch War, but doing this as well, he was deposed as emperor. So that was the last emperor. I think he was a Visenland emperor. I'm not 100% sure on that. But he was deposed, and who was elected to take his place? But his cousin, who'd saved the breadbasket of the empire, Wilhelm, the Count of Reikland. And ever since then, the emperor has always been the Count of Reikland. So that's not a huge amount of time, really. For the last sort of 80 years or so, last century, it's always been an emperor from Reikland, re-establishing Altdorf as the permanent capital of the empire for the last century or so, and that's the way things ended up the way they are today. A few years after this, there is a horrible attack in Reikland on a little shrine city, a little sort of religious town stopover for pilgrims, to the god Tal. Now, this is one of the older empire gods. I think it's the god of nature, if I remember correctly. But Tal's shrine is absolutely annihilated, and they get kind of word that there's an attack on the shrine. So from Altdorf, an army rides out to go and see what's going on, but they are ambushed by walking trees and smaller kind of versions of walking trees. And it's a bit of a fight, but they eventually manage to fight off this ambush and get to the shrine to find everybody slaughtered, and one of the sacred relics of the religion, known as the Fang of Tolroth, is disappeared. Now, what transpires happened is that Dryker, one of the branch raves of the Wood Elf clans, who'd actually turned against the current leaders of the Wood Elves, which is Orion and Ariel, and was kind of doing her own thing, and Durfu as well to a certain degree, and looking to conspire against them. So she's up to something that wiped out an entire religious village within Reikland around the year 2432. So that's the Wood Elves kind of starting to get involved more with modern Reikland. Now, so no one really knows that she did this within the Empire, we just know as the observer of the story. Following that, some 20 years later, so Empire can't really catch a break, Reikland is under threat again. This time from none other than Arkhan the Black, the right-hand man of one of the most grey threats to ever face the Empire, who Sigmar himself had to defeat, Nagash, the first necromancer, the kind of founder of all things undead. But Arkhan, his lieutenant, has led a complete attack on Altdorf, the capital. No one's quite sure how he managed to carve past the rest of the Empire, but he's leading a huge army of the dead, and they have attacked Altdorf, and it is a dire situation. However, they seem to have the force of arms to conquer. The defenses are holding, it all seems to be going all right. But little did they know, the whole invasion army of Arkhan the Black is nothing but a distraction. All Arkhan wanted to do was get beneath the Cathedral of Sigmar and steal the book that the Empire used all those centuries ago to defend against Manfred, the Liber Mortis. So Arkhan the Black steals the Liber Mortis and disappears off from Altdorf. One presumes in order to maybe one day resurrect his master and grow his own power. But Arkhan the Black doesn't manage to take Altdorf, yet again it holds, but he does manage to successfully steal what he was actually there for in the first place, and that was this book. So after Arkhan the Black, around the year 2470 of the Imperial calendar, we now have a new emperor, Arthur Wilhelm, who is Luitpold. Now, Luitpold is a good emperor, he's ruling at the time, and he's going through the Reichwald, the forest of Reikland with his son and his bodyguard, who he did establish, who his father, I think it was his father Wilhelm, but when Wilhelm came into power, he actually established what is known now as the Right Guard. Now, there is some lore which says that the Right Guard existed before Wilhelm, but there's also lore that says that Wilhelm founded the Right Guard, so whichever one you choose to believe, I guess, is right. But whatever's happening, the Emperor's riding through the woodland with the Right Guard and his son when they are set upon. The son is naught but an infant, and they're set upon by a whole bunch of beastmen. They're starting to get absolutely massacred. It looks done. It looks like the Emperor and his child, the line of emperors, will be ended right here when suddenly a huge rampaging army of wood elves wipe over the beastmen, leaving the few remaining men alive to just witness the slaughter in front of them, and then as quickly as they came out of nowhere, this army of wood elves disappears back into the woods. And indeed, the infant son of the Emperor at the time is none other than our own beloved Karl Franz. So this is his kind of first exposure to warfare as a little boy. And that firmly brings us on to the year 2502, where we have to assume, we're not really sure how the previous Emperor died, but he dies, and his son is a grown man by this stage, and his son becomes the Emperor, and Emperor Karl Franz is coronated in the city of Altdorf. Now, technically, this is actually the beginning of the Total War Warhammer timeline, because that's kind of the event I always take it as, is that Karl Franz is coronated, and that's what happens at kind of the beginning of the Empire campaign, so I've just kind of gone off that. But we could argue that the actual sort of current like Warhammer timeline before the end times takes us to about the year 2520, so we can incorporate some of this later on stuff as well. But what happens after he's coronated is he's immediately getting to work with the defense of the Empire, and the mages of the Celestial College have the ability to read the stars and predict the future to a certain extent, and they warn the newly coronated Emperor that there is a vast army of Norscan raiders that are about to pour out of the Sea of Claws and into the Empire, causing untold chaos. So Karl Franz is like, right, let's do this. Let's get on with being an emperor. And he gets all his troops together and marches north to Nordland, where he surprises all of the Norscan raiders on the beach with his full army, with his own Reichsguard charging down the leader of the Norscans himself and winning a famous victory, cementing him as like a solid general within the eyes of the people and kind of just reassuring everyone that, hey, this emperor might know what he's doing after all. Interestingly, as far as Total War Warhammer is concerned, kind of what the Runefang quest mission seems to be based on as well, that surprising the Norscans on the beach battle that you fight in the game. Now, after only a year after that incident, where he had to fight off the Norscans, another problem started to get at Karl Franz. Now, this wasn't directly tied to Reikland, but plays a little bit part in his story, that's where we're going to cover it. But what had happened is the Wood Elves, in an effort to avoid a huge Beastmen army coming into Athelloren, used their magic to divert the Wiesenland River, therefore driving this Beastmen army straight into the Empire. Now, something that had never happened before was about to happen, and Karl Franz, Emperor of Man, came to Athelloren and pleaded for their help. Now, no emperor had ever entered the forest, let alone spoken to the Wood Elves, and the Wood Elves weren't really sure how to take it. The idea being that he had inherited his greatness and was not in himself, as of yet, a great man. He hadn't proven himself, he was unblooded, no one really knew what he was about, so why should they help him? But they knew that, like, hey, this is the first time the Empire's ever reached out, maybe we can give them some help here. It took some convincing, but they eventually agreed, the Council of the Wood Elves. So they send an army to go and help Karl Franz, and they fight this huge Beastmen horde in Wiesenland, and they have a huge fight. Now, what happens is a Cygor lobs a huge boulder in the direction of Karl Franz in the midst of this battle. Now, they've mainly split up the battlefield in half, with Wood Elves taking one side, the Empire taking the other. Seeing this from across the battle with his keen vision, Orion is sort of torn here. Karl Franz has just been knocked off his horse, all the troops around him are dead, it looks like he's about to be run down with the guys, his bodyguard, kind of falling by the minute. It looks like this is the end of the new upstart emperor. And he can neither decide to let this emperor die because they're Wood Elves, what do they care? It won't affect the world in the grand scheme of things that this one man dies. Or they can see what this man has the potential to become, like the council had told Orion might happen. So Orion kind of reluctantly, even to himself, goes, oh bloody hell, and tramples across half the battlefield. And what transpires is that he ends up standing kind of both legs astride of an unconscious Karl Franz, while the Beastmen horde cuts down the last of his bodyguard and charges at the Emperor, with Orion standing in the way protecting him. Now, over the remaining hours, the battle unwound, with the Wood Elves and the Empire becoming victorious. It's said that by the end of the battle, Orion was cut and bloodied. He'd been sort of slashed over every part of his body. The holy ichor that was his blood had spilled onto the ground around him. And although he was absolutely almost devastated devastated, hugely wounded. There was not a single scratch on Karl Franz, who was still unconscious beneath his legs. So Orion had just stood there, had taken down every single one of the beastmen so that this emperor could live. The wood elves, without, they're not really one for talking, just sort of disappeared off into the woods after that, allowing the empire to recover Karl Franz's unconscious body. They took him back, he recovered, and a month later, a wood elf messenger arrives in Altdorf bearing a gift with a note. And they say they only will deliver it to the emperor himself. They're let into the royal chamber. They present it to the emperor, and it's a giant egg. And the note just says, "We will be watching you." From the wood elves. Now, this egg that the emperor got over the course of this action would turn out to be a griffin egg taken from the highest peak of the Grey Mountains, and Karl Franz went on to nurse and raise this griffin by himself, and this griffin would become the emperor's infamous mount, Deathclaw. So that's how he ended up getting Deathclaw as a gift from the wood elves, and it would go on to form very much part of the emperor's image, and was also some kind of validation that the wood elves, thought he had potential as a leader of men. Now, we're told that a couple of years later, in the year 2505, that a general starts to come to the forefront of Karl Franz's mind, and this is the General Kurt Helborg, the leader of his armies, his top military advisor, and the leader of the Reichsguard. He is, in fact, the Reichsmarshal of the Empire. Now, Kurt Helborg we'll get into a little bit later when we talk about other aspects of Reikland, but we've done a bit of a video on him. If you want a sort of a slightly more in-depth look at who Kurt Helborg is, do check out my Missing Legendary Lords for the Empire video, popping up in the top right-hand corner, or you'll find a link in the description below. So he's coming to the forefront, starts to lead a number of the Emperor's armies while the Emperor is otherwise occupied, and becomes a very well-established hero of the Empire. Another hero of the Empire becomes established, at least in the Emperor's eyes as well, who'd kind of been known for a while around the Empire, was after an occurrence in the year 2508. Reikland this time was under a huge amount of threat, not from the Greenskins, not from Chaos, not from the Beastmen, but from a singular massive dragon known as Malefrax the Mighty. Now, he was burning fields, forests, villages all over Reikland, and he had to be stopped. They sent armies after him, no one could stop him, until that is the Huntsmarshal Marcus Wolfhart, who is originally himself from Midland, and I do cover him fairly extensively in the Midland video, so check out the provincial playlist to find out a bit more about Marcus Wolfhart. But he fired not one, but 3 arrows straight through the dragon's heart, causing it to fall out of the sky and crash dead into the ground of Reikland, saving many more villages and countless lives. So the Huntsmarshal doing a good job there protecting the people of Reikland. Now then we get a few years of peace until Reikland is yet again threatened and has another chapter of its history written. And what happens this time is a self-made wound, shall we say. In the year 2512, one of the Elector Counts known as Marius Altdorf, the Mad Count, who is one of my favorite characters in Warhammer, and do check out the Missing Legendary Lords for the Empire video there, to find out about this lunatic. But in one of his fits of, let's say, not even lunacy, just one of his fits of over-honesty, shall we say, he decides to insult the wife, who admittedly was a pretty unattractive woman, of one of the Bretonnian nobility. Now, this Bretonnian was known as Bogard the Rash, and he ended up raising an army and marching into the Empire. Now, the Empire held on pretty okay here, making a stand at Helmgart, where they just cut down the Bretonnian cavalry with a cavalcade of Hellblaster volley guns, and just shot them all down as they charged up the valley. So they kind of were never really threatened by Bretonnia, but an instant where the two have clashed, caused by, an inappropriate word at a dinner party. So do remember, everybody, it never hurts to be polite. Anyway, the next real thing we have, until we're kind of right bang up to date with the Warhammer timeline, is Franz's eradication of a goblin Dwarven tribe in the year 2517. Now, 3 years later, it's when Archeon officially arrives, so that's really kind of the timeline we're talking in for Total War Warhammer, and that is the history of Reikland in terms of all the major threats, all the huge things that's happened here. Now, there have been a number of other things that have happened in the history of Reikland that I'm sure I have missed, and I apologize for that, but we couldn't cover everything just for the sake of time and editorial purposes. I mean, for example, it was the place where Sigmar saved a Dwarven king, ended up getting the weapon Galmaraz gifted to him by the dwarf. It was where Gotrek and Felix first met in the city of Altdorf, I think, after a riot. There's a lot of famous stuff that's happened in Altdorf and in Reikland, but we can't cover it all, unfortunately. But hopefully that was good, and that gave you guys an overall view of the history of the province. Now, moving on from the history of the province, let's look a little bit more at its geography. So, as we previously mentioned, there's a lot of farmland in Reikland, and it's all very fertile, producing huge amounts of grain and hay and whatever have you that farms need. There's also vineyards in the area, and what are described as dairy fields. I assume that just means green hills where cows can graze, and so you get dairy and meat and stuff like that. So all in all, a hugely productive province. Very rich for all the stuff it produces, because it has so much, it's actually able to export and produces a significant percentage of the entire food product of the empire, really placing it at the heart of the functioning of the empire in modern times. Some of this good fortune, it has been argued, has come in the last couple of centuries thanks to being in the privileged position of being the province that hosts the emperor. Now, although over the centuries and millennia the empire has kind of moved its capital around, over the last centuries it has been based out of Reikland, and with that comes like the eye of the emperor, so you tend to get the newer roads, the new canal projects being built, the implementation of new farming methods and technologies, and so there's the idea, particularly amongst the other provinces, that Reikland's been benefiting a bit too unfairly from these kind of pushes with empire willing to spend on Reikland, but not necessarily in some of the poorer provinces. Reikland also does a hefty summons and trade. Being connected to the River Reik, we see flowing here at the top of the map, they do trade with Marienburg. So stuff that comes in by sea to Marienburg gets transported through Reikland and then out to the rest of the empire. So they benefit, although they lost Marienburg, Reikland seems to benefit an awful lot from the trade coming in from an independent Marienburg that they can then sell on to other provinces. So there's a lot of merchants that practice in that trade, and although with this trade and with farming and stuff, and with the variety of tributaries that run into the river, canals and waterways are really the way that goods are moved around in Reikland. More than road, in fact. Really, it's just about sort of canal barges moving around, moving food produce, moving stuff imported from Marienburg, all the way up to the Empire by means of river. So those are really the veins that industry flows through. As we can also see, the northern part of Reikland is actually kind of heavily wooded. Now, this is the Reikwald forest, and it is actually relatively safe. Compared to the forests in Middenland or elsewhere in the Empire, further to the north or further to the east, you know, there's the odd beastman here and there, but for the most part, actually a relatively safe forest where really healthy timbering industry is taking place that is then sold on. You're not going to be risk of eaten by a giant every single day you go out to chop down a tree in the Reikwald. It's actually a relatively safe woodland compared to the rest of the Warhammer world. In terms of rough geographical regions, I suppose we should probably start with the Grey Mountains. Now, the Grey Mountains are inhabited by some dwarves, yes indeed, but they are also inhabited by men, and they do benefit from the idea of mining there, and they get iron, marble, gold, gems, and stuff like that out of the Grey Mountain range here. They also have two passes that go from Bretonnia to the Empire that's accessible to Reikland, and that is the Grey Lady Pass to the south and Axebite Pass guarded by Helmgart to the north. So those are the two ways into the Empire from that direction, and they're both controlled by Reikland, which puts it in a good position commercially as well. Now, as we mentioned in the history, there are dwarves up here, and indeed some towns have even incorporated the local dwarven clans into their town councils to really set down disputes to a minimum in terms of mining and stuff like that. Now, you'll see at the foothills of the Grey Mountains is a relatively clear area, and that area is known as the Vabagland. Now, this area here is really very much where a lot of the farming goes on in Reikland, and they do profit greatly from the rivers running through them. Now, as we mentioned in the history of Reikland, in the Runtwater incident, where the dwarves were a bit miffed about some mining dispute, they cut off the river from its sources up in the mountains, and that really almost completely dilapidated the farms further south over this mining dispute. So that's still kind of an active ransom scenario that the dwarves can pull the trigger on if they ever feel hard done by. But for the most part, water flows freely, and this is where most of the growing in Reikland is done. Now, another area where most of the animal farming is done is over here in the Skag Hills and the Hagakribs. I think that's how you say that, I have no idea. The one further to the east. Now, this is good grazing land for sheep and cows and things like that, but it also, particularly the Hagakribs, are the original burial mounds of the Ubergen people. So these guys are the ancestors of modern Reiklanders, where the people that Sigmar came from, and there's some grave robbing and stuff that goes on around that area to the east. But for the most part, really just sort of sheep and cows on that land eating the grass. There are maybe some ghostly sightings from time to time, maybe they'll hang around at night, and some treasure hunters might try their luck here as well. But for the most part, you know what, an actual fine place for your sheep to hang out. In terms of particular places in Reikland that are of note, and we're going to start off here in the northern section, and although it's not marked on the map, this is a settlement known as Frederheim. I think that's how you say it. Now, what this is a hospice surrounded by a small village under the control of the cult of Shalia, who is very much the old goddess in the Empire of healing. So they built a hospice, and most of the village around it tends to service the hospice, whether it's providing food or just cleaning sheets, stuff like that. Most of the village is built around this hospice in the area. Now, next to the hospice is also an insane asylum, where, you know what, under our modern interpretations of insane, probably wouldn't be a very cool place to hang out, but it is an insane asylum in the old school way, and it can sometimes produce people escaping, can be a bit of a dangerous place, but it's also kind of shrouded in secrecy. The priestesses and priests of Sheila who guard the hospice and the insane asylum don't tend to let outsiders in. If they don't know who you are, they won't let you anywhere near the place. So a little bit suspicious, but that's what's going on kind of the outskirts of Altdorf up there. Now, an area in the Grey Mountains that we briefly mentioned earlier in the timeline is Castle Drachenfell. Now, Castle Drachenfell is the place where that demonic army marched out of, if you remember to earlier in the video. And it is the home of an ancient entity that's said to predate the Empire and many other things besides. Now, the idea is that Castle Drachenfell is said to have been home to an individual by the name of Constant Drachenfell, who built a huge fortress of 7 massive towers that are said to have such an effect on the winds of magic that they make them almost visible to the normal person. They're that concentrated in the area of his castle. Now, Constant Drachenfell is spoken of in myth and legend even when the Empire was young, and us as the reader are able to find out that he is in fact about 15,000 years old, and he's said to predate even the arrival of the Old Ones in the Warhammer world. Now, there were some creatures that existed in the Warhammer world before the Old Ones ever made an appearance. That includes things like dragon ogres, stuff like that. But this guy's said to have come from a kind of hybrid tribe of humans and something else, and he is said to effectively be immortal. Now, he has haunted this corner of Reikland for a very long time, and he's had a few run-ins over the years. There was an incident where he had to fight Sigmar himself, and he'd raised an army of Gobbo slaves that he sent into the fledgling empire that Sigmar had to deal with and fight back. He's also said to have been responsible for something known as the Poisoned Feast. Now, this doesn't directly involve Reikland, it's more to do with Bretonnia, but I figured I'd tell you the story just to give you an idea of what this Constant guy is all about. Now, he's eventually said to have reformed. He went to the Emperor at the time and said, look, I'm sorry, this was a huge nightmare. Went to the Bretonians at the time, was like, guys, I'm sorry, this is crazy. I'm so sorry for my behavior in the past. I know I've been a thorn thorn in your side for all this time. How about you guys come up to my castle, we'll have a great feast, we'll let bygones be bygones. And so they all come up and they bring their noble families. As kids play, the castle's looking nice and not horribly ominous. And, at some point everyone's tucking into their meal. It's lovely cuisine that this mysterious figure has managed to cook up. Obviously, he's a huge character as well. He's said to be about 6 to 7 foot tall. He's all covered head to toe. He always wears a mask. You never see any part of his flesh, so no one's really sure what he looks like. And over the course of this feast, he never sort of ate himself, and people became increasingly feeling stranger and stranger, till eventually they realized they'd obviously been poisoned and that none of them could move. Now, the children were sitting at the kids' table, but the children were still being able to move around and didn't know what was happening to their parents when they tried to get their attention. At this point, Constant Drachenfell takes all of their children, gets them restrained, and ends up slaughtering all of the nobles' children in front of them as they sat there poisoned by the feast. Eventually killing the nobles themselves as well, obviously maybe leaving a survivor or two to tell of the tale, but this is the kind of evil we're dealing with when talking about Constant Drachenfell. More recently, around the time of Karl Franz's father, a chap by the name of Oswald von Königswald went up there with a party. They tried to deal with the Count. I think they banished him or killed him or something along those lines, and it's thought that he's not there, but the corruption in the castle, I think, got to the troops that banished him, and so the Emperor ended up having to send a purging army up there just to kill everything within the castle, and then it's been abandoned ever since. So ever since Karl Franz's father's day, we've never had anyone living there that we know of, and so that's the kind of dastardly mystery of Constant Drachenfell, who one has to surmise was responsible for the demon invasion some 300 years earlier as well. So all in all, a horrible chap with a horrible castle lives just in the Grey Mountains south of Reikland. Moving on to sort of cheerier places, we have Überschreik. Now, Überschreik guards Grey Lady Pass a way into the Empire. It aids commerce from sort of going from the mines to the rivers and getting it in to the main trade networks within the Empire as well. It has an interesting town council, which is also composed of the leaders of the local dwarven clans, and that's because a lot of the mining disputes are dealt with in Überschreik, and it's good to have the dwarves on side to prevent them damming up the rivers again and causing problems to the farmers downriver of them. So, good relationships with the dwarves in the city, and they're kind of standing there as the bastion of anything that wants to get into the Empire, including Bretonnians. But another interesting aspect is that the people of Überschreik are on the leading edge of a rising political climate within the Empire to increase the Empire's borders, to take more land, and they have their hearts set on expanding into Bretonnia and bringing Bretonnia forcefully into the fold of the Empire. So there's a contingent of political thinkers there that no, they're very hawkish on Bretonnia and want to bring Bretonnia into the fold as part of the Empire of Men. Moving east, we are going to Kemperbad, one of the cities in Total War Warhammer, and it's the only place said to be east of the river, on the eastern front of the river, and it's kind of traded hands a lot of times, this city. It's at some point been part of Sturland, it's at some points been part of Talabecland, and at the moment, obviously, it's part of Reikland. Now, it's said to be part of a deal done in 1066 of the Imperial calendar, where a leader by the name of Boris the Incompetent allowed them to have self-rule to a certain extent in Kemperbad, and this was sort of handed over to the largest merchants of the city. The difference between maybe Total War Warhammer and a lot of the Warhammer lore is that there is levels of individuality within the different cities in Warhammer. For example, Nulund is thought to be separate from the rest of the province it's in some certain cases in the lore. But for the most part, these are kind of known as free towns, but they're still part of the Empire. The problem was that Marienburg was no longer part of the Empire. That's why people get really upset about that one. But Kemperbad, still very much part of the Empire, but to some degree self-governed by the leading merchants of the city. And as such, they kind of have their own kind of tax policy, which enables them to keep a lot of the money they generate, which allows them to be a particularly wealthy little city as well. Now, they also are home to a large temple of Sigmar, with religion being particularly important there, and there's a large temple to Shala as well, the goddess of sort of hospitals and medical care and stuff like that. In terms of another interesting aspect about Kemperbad is it's also home to what is known as the Belladonna family. Now, this is a family of Tillian ancestry, and they have become a notorious crime family within Kemperbad, with their tendrils spreading all across the province of Reikland. They have, their fingers in a little bit of everything, but they are very much the mafioso of the Empire, and they run most of their operations out of Kemperbad, where they have a significant degree of control. So moving on from Kemperbad, we move a little bit further north to Castle Reikland. Now, Castle Reikland, we're just going to be a bit brief, is essentially the headquarters of the Reiksguard. That's all we need to know. They're mainly based out of here. The elite knights of Reikland, the protectors of the Emperor, established arguably at the time of Wilhelm, when the emperors moved back to Reikland. So a very important part in terms of the defense of the whole province here at Castle Reikland, also guarding it from any impending threats coming from the north. So moving on from Castle Reikland, we have Helmgard. Now, Helmgard is a fortress town. That's its main reason for being. The site of the famous victory versus Bretonnia in recent times, where the Hellblaster volley guns decimated their ranks of knights because of Marius Altdorf, the Count of Averland. But this is a hugely important defensive building within the Empire, and also a city that appears in Total War Warhammer as well. But that's kind of the main reason for it. It's a huge fortress town. It protects the borders of the Empire, one of the most significant fortresses within the Empire itself, let alone Reikland. So that's Helmgard. Now, let's get to the capital, the big one, the old city, Altdorf. Now, although Altdorf may not have always been the capital of the Empire, it has for some time been by far the largest city within the Empire itself. And its defenses, as I've mentioned a couple of times, have been built up over centuries. Now, despite the fact it being a near fortress, it does have all the trappings that one might expect to see in a big city: taverns, theaters, private clubs, as well as sort of large market areas, and, some seedy underbelly as well, with, some not so nice parts of town, particularly as the section here in the middle of the city, which is renowned as the poorer sector, and it's here that you'll find things like fighting rings, perhaps a red light district of sorts. This is kind of, where you don't want to go at night part of Altdorf, but most of the rest of the city is made up of larger townhouses, tower buildings, stuff like that. Well, tower buildings for medieval times, so 3 or 4 floors, as well as larger estates for the more wealthy among them in the city. There are some sights to behold, however, in the city, and it is said that it's actually impossible to navigate around Altdorf by, say, stuff like City Street or like a particular address. That system just isn't in place. There's stuff being torn down, built all the time, no real such thing as planning permission, so everyone navigates around by landmarks. That tends to be the way that people get around the city, as opposed to specific addresses. Now, in terms of the landmarks around the city, probably the most noteworthy, and one we should bring up, is the Emperor's Palace, where the emperors have been based at least for the last century, and on and off for the last 2.5 millennia. Now, the palace itself is a hugely sprawling complex, lots of different chambers and different rooms. It's not just a singular palace where it's Greek, it's also the residence for the emperor, all of his staff, all of his courtiers, all of that. Really just a hugely impressive building altogether. And that sits in a district relatively near to the Cathedral to Sigmar. Now, the cathedral is also a hugely immense structure. It's said that in the kind of open to the public front bit, it can get a bit unpleasant, as there's people rammed in there all the time. It can get a bit pungent with peasantry, and it can get a little bit smelly. However, in the more elite parts and different parts of the cathedral, where, the nobles go to worship and alike, that's a bit more pleasant and lively all round. There's said to be huge pieces of art commemorating Sigmar's life, from a massive mosaic of Sigmar in the ceiling to a beautiful mural on the wall depicting his famous victory at Blackfire Pass. It's just an immense building. There's also a separate area known as the Sun Chapel, which is where the Grand Theogenist himself goes to pray, and that chapel is only open to him. Now, they also house a lot of the initiates in the religion of Sigmar, so those will go on to become warrior, priests, and the like, or just servants within the church itself. So you have the initiate cells, which are literally just a bunk in an empty room, to the much more sort of ornately decorated rooms of the priests and higher-ups, including the archlectors and the grand theogonist. There are also a number of different quarters in the cities where different races live. So in the building of the Cathedral of Sigmar, actually, a number of dwarves were brought in to do a lot of the stonework, and many of them settled in the city afterwards, establishing what would be known as the Dwarf Quarter. Now, we're not exactly sure where in the city the Dwarf Quarter lies, but it is there, and there is thought to be an Elven Quarter as well, mainly filled with merchants and diplomats from the Elven people of Ulthuan. As I mentioned, there's also many markets, and to fill those markets, there's definitely a merchant quarter, mainly dealing with goods coming in from Marienburg and going out to the rest of the Empire, but there is this trade merchant quarter in this part of the city here. In terms of security, it is a very well-defended city, and the manpower behind that defense is the Altdorf City Guard, and they are based out of a building known as Emperor House, which is right here. It's also the headquarters of the spy network that the Empire has, and they're based out of also Empire House. So both the City Watch and the spies of the Empire operate out of this structure here. In terms of justice and retribution, we have the aptly named Palace of Retribution. Justice is dished out very harshly in Altdorf and in the Empire as a whole, but this is kind of where it is. In terms of judges, it's mainly priests and priestesses of Verena, the goddess of justice, who look after that area of the city. But this is also where you'll find the Executioner's Square, known as Widow's Plaza. It's also a bit of a fortress. If you're just to look at it from the outside, you wouldn't think it was a court system, but more of a fortress. And there are some defensive elements about it, but it does also contain courtrooms, and I think can act in some areas as a bit of a prison. I'm not entirely sure about that one. In terms of some other stuff that we also see within the city, but we're not exactly sure where to place it, is things like the Imperial Zoo. Now, the Imperial Zoo is where many of, particularly the nobility and armies of Reikland, get many of their mounts. So you have Pegasus in the zoo, you have griffins, you'll have a variety of animals from all over the old world and perhaps even beyond. And the prized possession of the zoo is the one Imperial dragon that the Empire has, and that is only being able to be ridden by Karl Franz from time to time. It's said that amongst all men in the Warhammer world, Karl Franz is the only one with the will to force the dragon to obey him. And so the Imperial Dragon at the Imperial Zoo can sometimes be mounted by Karl Franz in times of dire need, and he'll ride it into battle with him. Now, another famous structure in the city of Altdorf is the Imperial Engineers School. Now, this was founded by Leonardo de Miragliano. I have mentioned him as a potential legendary lord for the Dogs of War. Do check that out, popping up in the top right hand corner now, or down in the description below. He was a very interesting character, and he spent some time in the Empire and set up their engineering schools where they train their engineers, their outriders, their artillery crews, stuff like that. There is the very famous Nullen Gunnery School, which is a slightly different thing, and the two shouldn't be confused. But this one was founded by, as I said, Leonardo, a genius of his time, expert war engineer, as well as a master painter and gifted with many talents. In Altdorf, down by the river, there is also the docks. Now, the docks are a center for trade and commerce, but also house some of the Imperial fleet. Now, there are kind of conflicting reports on this. I have seen it said that the docks of Altdorf sort of hold the majority of the Imperial fleet, and I have seen it said that many of them moved to the docks off of Nordland and patrol the Sea of Claws. So there's two conflicting aspects as to where the Imperial Navy is, but I've no doubt there are some of the Imperial Navy based out of Altdorf itself. Now let's turn to magic. As we mentioned previously, Teclis, the wizard of fame across in Ulthuan, came over and taught the poor humans how to do magic properly. Now, they've never been as good as the elves at magic, but they're not bad anyway. So they try and give it a try, and they established the colleges of magic. I believe there are 8 of them, that's off the top of my head, I think. But they each established a base to teach other people how to use their particular wind of magic, and I believe all of them are represented within the city of Altdorf. Now, we only have details on a few, but I figured we'd give you an idea of what the colleges of magic look like in Altdorf, and how kind of steeped in mystery they are, and, you know, looked upon almost with, I don't want to say suspicion, but with maybe an eye of caution, particularly after something like the Night of 1,000 Arcane Jewels, where they almost brought down the entire city with their magical feuding. So, let's have a look starting with the Amethyst College. The lore of Amethyst magic is the study of the lore of death, as we know it in Total War Warhammer. The college itself is located right next to Altdorf's primary graveyard, you know, where these things tend to be located, very close to the housing for the Knights of Moor, who are a knightly order who tend to guard graveyards. But we've covered them in the previous videos, so we'll just stick to the Amethyst College. Now, the door to the Amethyst College is always open, so anyone's free to wander in, and there are many reports coming back of people who have wandered in and all they see is empty corridors and locked doors, and occasionally they'll see like dead bats or, you know, a corner full of dead spiders or something like that. They wander around, they get lost, and then they end up finding themselves at the front door again and leave, leading many people to believe that perhaps the building is abandoned, as there's no signs of life looking at it from the outside. It just looks like an empty old building. Now, when you walk in and the mages recognize your innate magical ability, the very similar thing will happen until like the last corner, where there you will be confronted with a fully done mage of the lore of Amethyst, who will then take you into the order as an initiate, where you will walk the kind of dark and gothic decor of the College of Magic until you are a fully qualified. So that's the way their kind of recruitment works. It's almost a test, whether you find your way around in their magical maze of a building that looks abandoned to all but the gifted, and make it to one of their mages to start your training. Now, the other one we will look at here is the Bright College, so the lore of flame and fire. Now, when you approach what would be the area where the Bright College is located, all you'll see is kind of a burned down ruin. Now, it'll look like a fire burnt through this area long ago. However, out of the corner of your eye, you might still see some timbers smoldering, some little sparks of flame drifting in the wind. It's all a bit strange. But what's going on here is that the wizards of the Bright College have covered their college with a magical shield, a magical barrier, if you will, that just shows a burning ruin to the outsider. But if you go past the magical barrier, you will see a huge building. You'll see a huge building with 21 towers, each with a massive bonfire atop, burning huge plumes of smoke into the air around it. That is what the Bright College looks like. It's very domineering. Now, any which way you approach the college from, once you're through that barrier, you'll automatically find yourself at the front gate. Now, if you are not welcome or not wanted, upon touching the front gate, you will instantly be consumed by fire and burned to death. So not particularly welcoming. However, if they do allow you to pass, the gate will open of its own volition. Throughout the college, all the furniture there is kind of fireproofed. It's all made of metal. You're trying not to set everything on fire. One has to imagine maybe their books are just metal sheets as opposed to paper and things like that. Just a lot of fire around the whole place. Everyone's giving off flames. Just a very kind of dangerous thing to do if you are afraid of fire. A lovely place to be if you're a pyromaniac, I have to imagine. And that is the Bright College. Moving on to the Celestial College. Now, this is the lore of heavens. No one seems to be able to notice the Celestial College. It's right there, but no one remembers it's there. If you walk past it, you wouldn't notice it as a building. It's just a trick of the mind that the Celestial College uses. It's not a magical barrier. It's there. You can see it. If you're looking straight at it, you can see it as a building, but as soon as you take your eyes off it, you don't remember it's there. And this, unlike the Bright College, only has 16 towers around it, so also a significantly sizable building, one has to imagine. Now, there are huge glass domes in the Celestial College. One imagines to observe the movement of the stars in the sky, as celestial wizards are wont to do, and to aid in their predictive powers as well, because they have that ability to read the stars and tell the future a little bit, as we learnt with Karl Franz fighting off the Norskins in the history of Reikland. Now, unlike the Bright College, which would kind of smell of ash and burning, or the Amethyst College, which is said to smell like embalming fluid, the Celestial College smells like fresh mountain air. So of the three of them so far, seems like the nicest place to hang about. Now, because of their ability to read the future, it's said that no one ever knocks on the door of the Celestial College. Anytime anyone approaches it, it's opened by one of their wizards who has prepared for you to arrive. So you're going to knock, boom, door opens, you kind of stumble through. It must be a bit of an annoying habit they have, if you ask me. But that's the Celestial College for you. The Jade College is an interesting one. Now, the Jade College is the Law of Life. This is an immense circular-looking building, but if you actually break it down from the inside, it's actually the beginning of a huge spiral. Now, it's all made of wood, and there's only a small door on one side of the building, but it has no windows, nothing else. It looks like the perfectly circular, massive tree trunk in the middle of the city. Now, at the front door, there are said to be 4 guards. A youth, a man in the prime of his life, in his early 20s, a middle-aged guy, and an old guy. Now, each one of them will be very highly skilled in martial fighting and not be a pushover at all. Very dangerous men, but representing the 4 stages of life, at least for men, that is. Now, once you go in, you start to notice the spiral. There's green ivy everywhere. It's all very woodlandy. There are some, like, open groves in it. It appears much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And sometimes you can see what appears to be rainwater kind of trickling down, or sort of a little bit of rain within the building itself, with its all sort of micro weather system. But that is the way that the Jade College operates. Now, moving on to the Light College, obviously the Law of Light. These guys have a very impressive building, but what they use as a means of defense is perhaps the most extreme. They, in effect, fold space-time around the place their building is. So you just cannot find it. If they don't let you, you just can't get there. It's a fold in space-time in which the college exists. And the college itself is meant to be this massive pyramid, seemingly made entirely of light. But once your eyes kind of adjust a little bit to the sheer brightness of the thing, you notice that it's not white, it is stone, but there's so much light within the building, it seems to be going through the stone and making the entire pyramid just gleamingly bright. An absolutely astounding sight if you were to look upon it. Now, on the interior, all the furnishings are made of white gold or silver. It's a very beautiful place to be, very intimidating, the college, the Light College there. And that's about it for the ones we know about within Altdorf. There will be the others as well, like Shadow, Amber, and Metal. I do believe they are represented in the city. I just couldn't dig out any particular details about their colleges within the boundaries of the city limit itself. So that's about it for the magical aspect of Altdorf, and kind of brings us to a close on looking at the city as a whole. Just a little bit of something for everyone. A massive city, fantastic place, really the hubbub. Now, it is argued that there is a horrible smell going around Altdorf. Now, that's put down just to the kind of medieval, a whole bunch of people in one place is always going to be stinky. So that's the idea, and it's said that the first emperor to actually move the capital away from what was then the city before Altdorf, did it because they thought the place just stank too much, and with time it probably hasn't got any better smelling the more people have moved in. So, you know, maybe not the best place to live, but, you know, it's got a little bit of everything, a little bit of culture, and, you know, you can do your shopping while you're at it. So there we go, all the adoration and trials and tribulations of Altdorf. So, moving on from Altdorf, let's start to talk about the people of Reikland. Being descendants from the tribe from which Sigmar was from, has filled Reiklanders with a kind of sense of their natural position within the Empire should be that of leadership. There is this sense that they place themselves above, they are the chosen people of the Empire, they really can just be like, okay, look, we should be the ones in charge, we are from Sigmar's clan, we're descendant from there, so you know what guys, just let us be in charge. And everyone else is like, hey, no, stop that nonsense. Now, this isn't a particularly malicious sentiment that they feel they should be in charge. They do it with a kind of joviality that I think serves to annoy the rest of the Empire severely. There's also the sense that Reiklanders are kind of the busybodies of the Empire, always trying to fix everybody else's problems. Now, they're afforded this because they provide so much extra food. They're never really pushing, except for when a huge war or something comes into town, they're never really pushing for survival. They survive quite happily, which allows them to devote themselves to what other provinces might consider foppish pursuits like poetry and plays, and included amongst these cultural pursuits is also a very keen eye for fashion, and fashions shift from month to month in Reikland, and everyone's trying to keep up with the latest. They see themselves very much, and perhaps are in fact, the fashion trendsetters of the Empire. So if you're looking for anyone to blame for the feather hats and the knee-high socks of the look of the Empire within the fancy universe, do blame the Reiklanders for that. That's all they're doing, most likely. Now, this also gives them a lot of spare time to try and put the world to right, and they talk about the problems of other provinces, and often a very famous line that Reiklanders are quoted for is always saying something must be done about it. Oh yes, we should definitely do something about that. This can be annoying for other provinces' perspectives, but it also makes Reiklanders very noble in terms of their ideas of the Empire and the fact that the unification of the Empire should be a thing. And when you're ever looking to recruit armies or troops for armies, Reiklanders will always be the first to volunteer. They have a huge respect for the military, and they have a long history within the military itself, and if they're helping other provinces, they're more than happy to do so, despite the fact that other provinces think they're being, looking down their noses at the rest of them just because they're so comfortable in Reikland. At their best, Reiklanders are described as friendly, sociable, open-minded, optimistic, educated, and energetic. However, at their worst, people see them as busybodies, and has been famously put, philandering, wife-stealing pig botherers. So many outside of Reikland tend not to appreciate them. They've swept many a Midlander's wife off her feet with regalia of poetry and very lovely looking adoration of their clothes. In terms of the religion of the people of Reikland, Sigmar obviously is the mainly worshipped god there, followed by Dyrath, who's actually a different name for a god known throughout the rest of the Empire as Rhea, and Shalia, who we discussed earlier, the goddess of medicine. Rhea, I think, is the goddess of nature, if I remember correctly. That might be wrong, but I think that's it. So those are the kind of main religions within Reikland, and those are the ones that are mainly worshipped. Moving on from the people, let's start to talk about the military. Now, the colours of Reikland are red and white, or rather white and red, and most of their armour and costumery about the military is in that colour. Now, as I mentioned, Reiklanders are always the first to volunteer for war, and many of the officers within the Imperial Army itself are actually young Reiklander nobles, a vast, overwhelming majority of them, in fact. And that's because they're just the first, they don't mind laying their lives on the line for the idea of the Empire. They're fully sold on that concept. They're not just looking out for their province, they're looking out for the whole thing, and so they will always volunteer for military service at the drop of the hat, and that's kind of their ethos on it. Now, there's kind of two actual main military, there's several military bodies within Reikland itself, but there's two main ones. There's the kind of state troops, the provincial troops, which are these guys here, and the city of Altdorf itself has its own city watch with multiple regiments who serve also as like a secondary army within Reikland itself. Now, their colors are slightly different. They prefer the red and blue, and that kind of distinguishes them from the state troops from the rest rest of the province. Now, these guys' main responsibilities will be about training to man the wall, man the defensive. They will go out on patrol. They will sort of contribute to any kind of war effort, but they do have very different coloration and very different sort of soldiering training. Their sort of main priority is the defense of the walls, but they are used in the main military as well. So that's the idea of the Altdorf regiments. Now, in terms of specialized regiments, we've mentioned them a couple of times, but we have the Reiksguard, the best knights around. They are the bodyguard to the Emperor, founded under Wilhelm II, as the story will be sticking to. Now, I don't believe, I might be remembering this wrong, but I think the Reiksguard in Total War Warhammer are golden, whereas it would be kind of cool to see them in their actual white regalia. Now, I'm not sure if that's something that Games Workshop changed later on, but I've always liked this look of the white and red for the Reiklanders. So, the Reiksguard, still the Emperor's protectors, great knights, they will serve in multiple battlefields, and very much kind of the spear point of any Reiklander army. So moving on from the Reiksguard, we have the Karabberg Greatswords. Now, we've spoken about these guys a little bit in my Middenland video, but Karabberg is a city now in Middenland, but it has been subject to different border disputes. So at times it's been part of Reikland, at times it's been part of Middenland. It kind of goes back and forth. Now, at one point when it was under the control of Reikland, the Midlanders were trying to take it back, and it ended up in an armed dispute. Now, the Greatsword Regiment posted there at the time were wearing their usual Reikland colours, which was the all-white, and by the end of that battle, where they fought a bloody defence in the name of Reikland, holding off the Midland army, the regiment of Greatswords based out of Karabberg had completely stained their white uniforms red, and as such, now in honour of that elite regiment, the best swordsmen of Karabberg and Reikland as a whole are put into the Greatsword unit and are given that red uniform. And it should be only red. They seem to have added some white accents now that, you know, that's over. But the Karabberg Greatswords, all in red, ready to fight, still in honour of that first regiment that made a name for themselves, covering their uniforms in blood in the name of the defence of Reikland territory. So the Greatsword, an elite Greatsword unit, fantastic little story behind them, an elite fighting force available to the Reikland armies. Then we have the Company of Honor, a halberd unit made out of the best of soldiers from different regiments within Altdorf's army. So they will just train, and whoever's the best fighters automatically get snapped up and put into this regiment, the Company of Honor. Common men can join the army, and they are the ones who are the best of the best. So it's a meritocracy as far as that's concerned, but they also have the honor of being led by a nobleman. Now, not all regiments are led by noblemen. Sometimes you'll just get a sergeant who's common born, but the Company of Honor will be common men led by a nobleman, and it's always usually the youngest brother. So maybe not the most important nobleman, but, you know, a nobleman nonetheless. Their current leader is Otto Hellstein, and whenever they leave the city, a massive trumpet goes off. So you know when they're coming and going, they're sort of that famous. And they are always sort of very well known for their yellow plume and black plate steel that they wear as part of their uniforms. Other than that, they wear the red and blue of Altdorf. So that's them going into war. A very interesting regiment, an elite halberd regiment. Pretty great. And the final unit we're going to mention here are the Demigryph Riders. Now, I mention this because, as far as I understand, Demigryph Riders aren't unique to Reikland, but when I ever look up lore about them, whether it be in the Army Book of the Empire or whatever, it's only ever mentioned that to get their mounts, Demigryph Rider Knights go into the Reikland Forest, and there they kind of battle with their potential mounts and eventually like break them in, and that's how they get their mounts. Now, the idea here is that they might be savagely wounded, and many of the Demigryph Knights will have huge scars across their body from the time they have to fight their mount to control it. And it's said to, I think there's a problem with bringing them up from birth. I don't think it works properly, so they have to go and catch them when they're adults, I believe. So that's how these knights are done, and because I only ever see them mentioned as picking up these animals in the Reikland forest, I decided to tie them in case someone was going to mention it, or in case they can't actually be found anywhere else and they're only found in the Reikland forest. So the Demigryph knights may be a unique thing to Reikland, but I don't think so, but I just thought it was maybe worth a mention as an elite fighting unit as well. So that kind of does it for the military, guys. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the leadership of Altdorf, and as such, the leadership of the Empire. Now, we all know Karl Franz is the Emperor, but he also has a council around him. Now, some of the most famous characters in this council I've kind of already covered in my Missing Legendary Lords video, but we'll just kind of go through them and give you a bit of a brief summary. But we have Kurt Helberg, the leader of the armies of Reikland when the Emperor isn't leading them himself. A general without peer. He is just a fantastic fighting man whose opinion the Emperor values highly. Now, he is so highly valued that of the 2 lost provinces that have happened in the Empire so far, we discussed a little bit earlier the province of Solon that got destroyed by Gorbad Ironclaw. Now, there's also the province of Drakwold that got destroyed. But there are 2 spare Runefangs because those no longer exist as provinces and Runefangs were made for them. One of them's kept in the vaults of Altdorf, and Karl Franz saw fit to award the other to Kurt Helberg. So he's the military advisor for Karl Franz. We also, of course, have Balthasar Gelt, the Supreme Patriarch. Now, the Supreme Patriarch, each College of Magic will have its own patriarch, the leader of the college, the leader of all the mages of that kind of magic, and then they each put one forward to fight for the honor of being the Supreme Patriarch, the representative on the council of all magic users within the Empire. And that's who Balthasar Gelt is. We've had him in the game for quite some time. Great character, but he is also on the council. And the third guy here on the images is, of course, the Grand Theogenist Volkmar the Grim, in charge of all religious affairs. And on the far right, a face you might not recognize, but it's an image I found that is kind of representative of the person it is, and that is the image of Lector Agatha von Barn, I think it is, from the cult of Verena, who's the goddess of justice in the old gods of the Empire. Now, she is essentially the head of the justice system. Verena is very much, I think, kind of like an Athena stroke, the symbol for justice, goddess. That's the idea behind her. So she's kind of the supreme judge in all things judicial to do with the Empire. Some other people who would just look like generic people, there wouldn't be anything to how they look, and there's no real images available for them on this council, include Amadeus Mention, who's the Chamberlain of the Seal, so essentially the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And we also have Lotte Hoxvoll, Baroness of Stimmerwald, who's in charge of finances, said to come from a notoriously stingy family. They're kind of very known for penny pinchers, and who better to put in charge of the imperial coffers. And there's also Count Siegfried von Walfen even. Now, he comes from a family which I think controls vast amounts of land in the southeast of Reikland, but he has become the spy master for the Empire. Now, he is said to have earned the nickname Witch Taker for some of his more notorious deeds, and he is the cousin of the Emperor Karl Franz. And last but by no means least, we have Arnie Demstadt, who is the Duke of Heilborn, and he is Chamberlain of the Imperial Household. So I assume that he's in charge of the court and the people who get to see the Emperor. I think that's what that means. So with all of this, you have the leading council of the Empire and the leading council of the city of Altdorf itself. Now, the council is important, but the most important person of all is perhaps, as you all know, Karl Franz. Now, I'm just going to mention quickly another character here by the name of Luther Hust. Now, Luther is the protector of Karl Franz, his bodyguard, perhaps the best fighter the Empire has to offer in terms of a man with a blade in his hand. But he doesn't really have a huge role in the governance of Reikland, so I haven't really covered him in depth in this video. But a guy worth remembering. But anyway, the Emperor Karl Franz, we've covered on and off throughout this video different elements of his life, from being an infant boy of Luitpold to growing up, being attacked by those beastmen, saved by the Wood Elves, and coming of age. It's believed he also has a sister who married off quite early, but she doesn't seem to be any kind of politically important person as such. She's not vying for power, but Karl Franz does have a sister as well. I believe she's a younger sister. He's just really kind of like the man's man, the emperor of emperors. Fantastic fantastic statesman, fantastic general, great man at running the empire, both from an administrative point of view as well as a militaristic one. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive on the whole lore around Karl Franz. We've covered how he got his famous griffin, Deathclaw, in terms of the Wood Elves gifting it to him after that battle, hoping he would one day make a great emperor. But he is the shield that fights back the darkness for the empire. A fantastic emperor, perhaps arguably the best they've had since Sigmar himself. And some more zealotous parts of the population even believe that Karl Franz is Sigmar reborn. Now, things weren't always smooth sailing for Karl Franz. In the early days, sort of the year 2502, when he was coronated, he only kind of narrowly won against Boris Todbringer, who was the other guy competing to be named emperor, the Count of Middenland. Now, Boris has never really let this go, and the two of them don't have the best of relationships, but there we go, that's how that happened. Now, he's fought in many famous battles, including some of the ones we've mentioned already against the Norseguns and the Beastmen, but he's also said to have participated in the Battle of Norduin versus Bretonnia in the year 2502, so the year of his coronation as well. Had a lot going on that year. Fought the Norseguns, fought Bretonnia. He also had to take on a greenskin war led by an orc known as Spleen Ripper on the battlefield known as the Field of Blood, and every test he's ever had to face, he came up trumps. Now, one time he maybe is considered to have failed is in the year 2519, where the Empire got word that a huge war was coming up through Blackfire Pass, and Marius Altdorf tried to send word to the Emperor to get help, but Karl Franz didn't arrive in time, leading to the death of one of the favorite characters in the Warhammer world, the Mad Count himself, who died fighting in that ravine to save the Empire. Karl Franz eventually did arrive, smashing up the Greenskin War, which no one had seen the likes of since the original Battle of Blackfire Pass. It was a huge deal that Marius Altdorf died in, but he still managed to fight it off with his trusty Deathclaw holding Galmaraz, the ancient hammer. So that about sums it up, guys, for Karl Franz and what's going on with him in Reikland. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to check out some of the other provinces if you haven't seen them already. As always, a huge thank you all for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one.